Imagine stepping off a ship after months at sea, exhausted, half-starved, with nothing around you but unbroken wilderness. No shelter. No stored food. No idea what the coming winter will bring. Somewhere in the trees, you can feel eyes watching you. And somewhere in your gut, you already know that not everyone standing beside you right now will still be alive by spring. This is not fiction. This is the reality that faced thousands of settlers who crossed an ocean, or later crossed a continent, chasing the promise of a new life in America. Their first winter was not a season. It was a test. And for a staggering number of them, it was a test they failed. Over the centuries, from the swampy banks of the James River to the frozen passes of the Sierra Nevada, the story repeats itself with haunting consistency. People arrived too late in the year. They underestimated the cold. They ran out of food before the frost even set in. And when the snow finally came, it didn't just fall from the sky, it became a wall between them and survival. Today we're going to walk through that wall, season by season, colony by colony, wagon train by wagon train, and ask a question that still feels uncomfortable more than 400 years later: how did anyone survive the first winter in America at all? Let's go back to the very beginning, to the year 1607, when a group of roughly 100 English colonists sailed up a river in present-day Virginia and founded a settlement they called Jamestown. On paper, it was a bold commercial venture, backed by investors in London who dreamed of gold and trade routes to Asia. In reality, it was a death trap. The colonists chose a swampy, mosquito-infested peninsula because it was easy to defend from a naval attack, not because it had clean drinking water or fertile soil. That single decision would come back to haunt them almost immediately. The site sat right at the boundary between fresh and salt water, which meant the river was often brackish and contaminated with human waste from the settlement itself. Add in the swarms of mosquitoes carrying malaria, and you have a recipe for sickness before winter even arrives. By the time the cold set in, dozens of colonists were already dead or dying from dysentery, typhoid, and salt poisoning. And here's the detail that surprises most people: many of these men were gentlemen, adventurers, and craftsmen, not farmers. They had sailed across the Atlantic with dreams of striking it rich, but almost no practical knowledge of how to grow food or build lasting shelter in an unfamiliar climate. So when autumn turned to winter, Jamestown had almost nothing stored away. Supplies from England were unreliable, delayed by storms, shipwrecks, and simple negligence. The Powhatan Confederacy, the powerful network of Algonquian-speaking nations who controlled the region, occasionally traded corn with the struggling colonists, but that relationship was fragile, shaped as much by mutual suspicion as by cooperation. When tensions flared, that lifeline could vanish overnight. Then came the winter of 1609 to 1610, a period so devastating that history remembers it by a single, chilling name: the Starving Time. By that point, relations with the Powhatan had deteriorated into open hostility, and the English were essentially trapped inside their own fort, unable to safely hunt, fish, or forage beyond the walls. Roughly 500 colonists were alive when the siege-like conditions began. When ships finally arrived the following spring, only about 60 were left. Think about that number for a moment. Nearly 9 out of every 10 people who entered that winter did not walk out of it. What happened inside those walls during those months is almost too grim to describe in detail, but historical and later archaeological evidence tells us the colonists were pushed past every ordinary limit of desperation. They ate their horses. Then their dogs and cats. Then rats, mice, and snakes. They boiled shoe leather and chewed on it just to have something in their stomachs. Some dug up graves in a horrifying search for anything edible. And in 2012, archaeologists uncovered the actual physical evidence that confirmed what colonial documents had long hinted at: butchery marks on the skull and leg bone of a 14-year-old girl, now known to researchers as Jane, proving that survival cannibalism did occur at Jamestown during that brutal winter. It remains one of the most sobering confirmed details in early American history, a reminder that the frontier's danger wasn't always a wild animal or a musket ball. Sometimes it was simply hunger, stretched past the point of humanity. Jamestown eventually survived, barely, thanks to new leadership, new supply ships, and a shift toward growing tobacco as a cash crop that finally gave the colony an economic reason to exist. But its first winter set a pattern that would echo again and again across the American frontier for the next 2.5 centuries: arrive unprepared, underestimate the land, and pay for it in human lives. 13 years later, a very different group of English settlers faced their own brutal introduction to American winter, this time much farther north, on the rocky coast of what is now Massachusetts. In November of 1620, after more than 2 months at sea, the Mayflower dropped anchor near Cape Cod. The passengers, roughly half of them religious separatists we now call the Pilgrims, had originally planned to settle in Virginia, within the boundaries of the existing colonial charter. But storms, navigational errors, and dwindling supplies pushed them hundreds of miles off course. By the time they sighted land, it was already deep into autumn, far too late in the year to plant crops or build substantial shelter before the New England winter arrived in full force. Before they even stepped ashore, the passengers drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, a short agreement establishing rules for self-governance in this uncharted land. It's remembered today as an early milestone in American democracy, but in the moment, it was really just a group of frightened, freezing people trying to create order out of chaos before the real crisis even began. And the real crisis began almost immediately. The Pilgrims spent their first weeks in America living aboard the cramped, disease-ridden Mayflower while scouting parties searched the coastline for a place to settle. When they finally chose the site of an abandoned Wampanoag village called Patuxet, cleared years earlier, tragically, by a massive epidemic that had wiped out most of its original inhabitants, they began building shelters in freezing, often snowy conditions. Construction was painfully slow. Many colonists were too weak or sick to work. That first winter, sickness tore through the settlement with terrifying speed. Scurvy, pneumonia, and what colonists described simply as the general sickness swept from person to person in the damp, overcrowded shelters. By the time spring arrived in 1621, roughly half of the more than 100 people who had sailed on the Mayflower were dead. Entire families were wiped out. At one especially dark point, only 6 or 7 colonists were healthy enough to care for everyone else, cooking, hauling water, and burying the dead, often at night, so that watching native observers wouldn't realize just how devastated and vulnerable the colony truly was. It's worth pausing here on something many people don't realize: the Pilgrims survived that winter, and the ones that followed, largely because of Native American knowledge and assistance, not despite it. In March of 1621, an Abenaki man named Samoset walked into the settlement and astonished the colonists by greeting them in English, learned from earlier contact with English fishermen. He soon introduced them to Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto, a member of the Patuxet people who had himself been kidnapped by English sailors years earlier, sold into slavery in Spain, and had eventually made his way back home, only to discover that disease had wiped out his entire village while he was gone. Despite that almost unimaginable personal tragedy, Squanto taught the surviving Pilgrims how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, where to fish local waters, and which plants in the surrounding woods were safe to eat. Without that knowledge, most historians agree, the Plymouth colony likely would not have survived. The autumn harvest celebration that followed in 1621, the event now mythologized as the First Thanksgiving, was, in historical reality, a far more complicated moment than the simple, friendly feast often depicted in classrooms. It represented, however briefly, a fragile alliance between the Wampanoag leader Massasoit and the desperate, still vulnerable colonists, an alliance built on mutual necessity as much as goodwill, and one that would tragically deteriorate within a generation. So already, in these 2 earliest and most famous American colonies, we see the same brutal lesson taking shape. Timing was everything. Arrive too late, without enough food stored and without local knowledge of the land, and winter would do what muskets and rival powers could not: it would kill you slowly, methodically, and in staggering numbers. But the frontier wasn't only a story of the 1600s. As American settlement pushed relentlessly westward over the following 2 centuries, the same deadly pattern played out again and again, in new landscapes, against new and often even harsher winters. Consider the wave of settlers who pushed onto the Great Plains in the mid to late 1800s, drawn by the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered up to 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to live on it and farm it for 5 years. It sounded like a dream. The reality, for thousands of families, was a brutal introduction to a landscape almost completely unlike anything they'd known back east or in Europe. The Great Plains offered almost no trees for lumber, which meant many homesteaders couldn't build traditional wooden cabins at all. Instead, they cut thick blocks of prairie sod, held together by dense root systems, and stacked them like bricks to build what became known as soddies, one-room homes with dirt floors, dirt roofs, and walls that leaked mud every time it rained. These structures were surprisingly good insulation against the cold, but they came with their own nightmare: insects, snakes, and rodents burrowing directly through the walls and sealing into the living space, sometimes literally falling on families as they slept. And then there was the wind. Anyone who has stood on the open prairie in winter understands almost instantly why blizzards on the Great Plains were so deadly. There was nothing, no forest, no hills, no windbreak of any kind, to slow gusts that could reach hurricane force, driving snow horizontally with such violence that visibility dropped to zero within seconds. Homesteaders learned to string ropes between their house and their barn, because a settler who stepped outside during a sudden whiteout blizzard could become disoriented and freeze to death just yards from their own front door, unable to find their way back. One of the most devastating examples came to be known as the Children's Blizzard of January 1888. The day had actually started unusually warm for the season, and many children walked to their one-room schoolhouses without heavy coats. Then, within minutes, the temperature plunged and a wall of ice and wind swept across the plains from Montana to Texas. Teachers faced an agonizing choice: keep students trapped in poorly heated schoolhouses that might run out of fuel, or attempt to walk them home through a storm that had already dropped visibility to almost nothing. Historians estimate that roughly 250 people died in that single storm, a significant number of them children caught between school and home. It remains one of the deadliest and most heartbreaking weather disasters in American frontier history. For homesteading families who survived their first prairie winter, the experience left permanent scars. Diaries and letters from the era described families huddled together for warmth around stoves fueled by dried buffalo dung, known as buffalo chips, because wood was simply too scarce to use for daily heating. Food supplies, often based on a single harvest with little margin for error, could run desperately short by February or March, long before spring planting was even possible. Isolation compounded every hardship. The nearest neighbor might be miles away across open, snow-covered land, meaning that a medical emergency, a difficult birth, or a house fire could become a death sentence with no realistic hope of outside help arriving in time. Yet arguably no single first winter tragedy on the American frontier is more infamous than what happened to a group of emigrants who became known to history as the Donner Party. In the spring of 1846, a group of around 90 men, women, and children set out from Illinois and Missouri, bound for California, drawn westward by promises of fertile land and a fresh start. Their fatal mistake was trusting a shortcut. A promoter named Lansford Hastings had published a guidebook claiming his so-called Hastings Cutoff would save emigrants significant time by cutting south of the established Oregon Trail route through Utah and Nevada. In reality, the shortcut led the party through brutal, poorly mapped terrain, including the punishing Wasatch Mountains and the unforgiving salt flats of the Great Salt Lake Desert, that cost them weeks of precious time and left their draft animals and supplies badly depleted. By the time the Donner Party reached the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada in late October, an early and unusually severe winter storm had already begun sealing the mountain passes with snow. They were trapped, roughly 150 miles short of their destination, at what is now known as Donner Lake, with winter closing in around them and supplies already critically low. What followed was one of the most harrowing survival ordeals in American history. Trapped through months of relentless snowfall, with drifts reported to have reached 20 feet or more in places, the emigrants built crude cabins and lean-tos, and slowly began to starve. They ate their oxen, then boiled hides and even shoe leather for a thin, barely nutritious broth, echoing the same grim desperation seen at Jamestown more than 2 centuries earlier. As deaths mounted through December and January, some survivors, facing utter starvation, ultimately resorted to eating the flesh of those who had already died, a fact confirmed by numerous survivor accounts and later historical investigation, and one that has permanently attached itself to the Donner Party's name in American memory. Rescue parties eventually fought their way through the snowbound passes beginning in February of 1847, but by the time the last survivors were brought out in April, roughly 40 of the original 90 emigrants had died. Nearly half the party did not survive their first mountain winter. The disaster became a cautionary tale told and retold across the West, a brutal reminder that the frontier didn't care about ambition, timelines, or dreams of a new life. It only cared about preparation, timing, and how well you understood the landscape you were entering. So what actually determined whether a group of settlers lived or died during that first brutal winter? Looking across these very different stories, Jamestown's swamps, Plymouth's rocky coast, the wind-scoured Great Plains, and the snowbound Sierra Nevada, a few consistent factors emerge again and again. Timing mattered enormously. Groups who arrived early enough to build solid shelter and store adequate food before the first hard frost had dramatically better odds than those who arrived in October or November, already racing a clock they couldn't win. Local knowledge mattered just as much, if not more. Time after time, the settlers who survived were the ones who learned, often through direct cooperation with native peoples who had lived on and understood that land for countless generations, which foods were safe, where fresh water could reliably be found, and how to build shelter suited to the specific climate they now called home. And finally, sheer physical preparation mattered. Colonies and wagon trains stocked with practical farmers, hunters, and skilled tradespeople consistently fared better than those filled primarily with people whose skills and expectations had been shaped for a very different kind of life back home. But perhaps the most striking thread running through all of these stories is a simple, sobering truth: survival on the American frontier was never guaranteed by courage or determination alone. Jamestown's colonists were not cowards. The Donner Party's emigrants were not fools. Homesteading families on the Great Plains were not naive. They were ordinary people who made a series of understandable decisions, in an era with limited maps, limited weather forecasting, and no real way to know what winter in an unfamiliar land would actually demand of them. Some paid for those decisions with everything they had. And that's really the story that gets lost in the mythology of the American frontier, the version filled with rugged individualism, manifest destiny, and triumphant expansion. Behind that mythology sits a far more human reality: thousands of ordinary families who simply gambled everything on a single winter, and for many of them, that winter did not gamble back kindly. The frontier wasn't conquered so much as it was survived, one desperate, freezing season at a time, by people who often had no idea just how close they'd come to becoming another name lost to history. If you had been standing at Jamestown's fort, or inside a Plymouth shelter, or trapped in the snow at Donner Lake, knowing what you know now about how close each of these groups came to disaster, would you have made the journey at all? Tell us in the comments what you would have done differently.